They had labeled the planet a statistical impossibility, an evolutionary mistake, a swirling hellscape of tectonic madness, viral chaos, volatile weather, and apex predators that operated not on instinct, but on something dangerously close to malice. They had placed Earth in the restricted archives, marked it as a Class 12 Deathworld, the kind of designation whispered about in the dark corners of galactic war rooms where strategists spoke not of conquest, but of containment. No intelligent life could have developed under those conditions. The Galactic Union had concluded, because statistically, no species should survive where everything wanted you dead, and most of it was faster, stronger, or more venomous than you. But then came the signal, faint but deliberate, a tight, band transmission encoded in a language never seen before but astonishingly fast to decrypt, as if it had been designed not just for comprehension, but to be comprehended. "Greetings from Earth," it said. "We would like to talk." And that was when the Council realized its calculations had missed something vital, not the existence of humans, but their willingness to reach, to risk, to bleed, to build meaning in the wreckage of hostile evolution. They sent the Violian ambassador first, a species chosen for its composure and diplomacy, the kind of being that could enter a nest of barbarians and emerge with a trade agreement. But when the Violian returned early silent, trembling, and wide-eyed, it carried only a simple message. They laughed, they offered me fermented sugar, then they asked about my childhood trauma. That was the first sign. The humans had not met hostility with protocol or fear, but with curiosity, emotional directness, and something disturbingly close to charm. Not programmed charm, not the synthetic flattery of career diplomats, but raw, unsettling authenticity, a disarming openness that bypassed centuries of interspecies conditioning. The Council assumed it was a trap, some form of psychological warfare, but the psychological division could not find any pattern, any script. It was not manipulation. It was simply how they were. They connected with their eyes, with their voices, with stories and laughter and pain poured out like wine over a fire. And somehow that connection proved more effective than shields or warships. They told stories of their past, not the grand conquests, but the losses, the betrayals, the defiance in the face of impossible odds. They spoke of Hiroshima and Apollo, of burning cities, and the bones of civil rights leaders buried under marble statues. They showed their madness, their brilliance, their grief, all without asking permission, as though vulnerability itself was their national weapon. One Sorethi diplomat, known for his mastery of formal negotiation, broke down in tears after a single-hour-long conversation with a human linguist who explained with aching beauty the word forgiveness. The Sorethi had no direct translation. After that, their species adopted a version of the term into official doctrine. This was not diplomacy as the galaxy knew it. This was something else entirely. It was not order, it was entropy with empathy. It was unpredictability turned into persuasion, sincerity weaponized with surgical precision, and the humans did it with tea, with poetry, with poorly translated jokes about ducks in bars. Soon, they began to appear not just in council meetings, but on talk shows, in military strategy summits, on children's broadcasts. Children adored them. The alien young saw something in humanity that terrified their parents not because it was dangerous, but because it was inviting. It said, you can cry, you can scream, you can be messy and still be worth something. The council had seen worlds conquered by fire and steel, but never by music, by dancing, by philosophical one-liners casually dropped over black coffee at 3 in the morning. It was not long before factions began to form. Some wanted humans banned from diplomatic proceedings entirely, citing psychological destabilization of established norms. Others demanded they be given their own diplomatic caste, a role once reserved for the most neutral and predictable species. Neutral, predictable, the humans were neither. That was the point. They were chaos with a smile, disaster wrapped in compassion, and yet they solved problems that no algorithm could untangle. In one disputed territory, where two species had been at war for 200 years over a planetary border invisible to the naked eye, it took a single human mediator 3 hours, a bottle of whiskey, and a hand-drawn map to end the conflict. "I just asked them what they were afraid of," she later said, "and then I told them what I was afraid of. We all cried. Then we figured it out." The council began calling it Deathworld Diplomacy, a way of engagement so volatile it should not have worked, and yet inexplicably it did. Because humans did not negotiate to win, they negotiated to understand, to feel, to be felt. They broke every protocol not because they were rebels, but because they had never known the rules in the first place. They had evolved on a world where survival meant not just adapting to danger, but becoming it, and yet they emerged not hardened, but softened, violent in defense, but tender in expression. They called this strength. The galaxy called it madness. And then came the vote, a decision to grant humans full diplomatic access to all major peace councils, including the ancient and secretive hegemony chambers, a place where even the mention of war could destabilize entire quadrants. The vote passed barely, and when the first human stepped into that sacred hall, wearing jeans and a hoodie with a cartoon octopus on the back, the room fell silent. He did not bow. He did not offer credentials. He simply looked around, smiled, and said, "You all look so tired. Maybe we should try being honest for once." No one spoke, no one interrupted, because they could all feel it. Something had shifted, something deep and irreversible. This was not the beginning of a new diplomatic era. This was the beginning of a species redefining the very concept of power. And somewhere, in the far reaches of uncharted space, something ancient and watching blinked its unseen eyes and said, not aloud but in the currents of dark energy that pulse between stars, "They have begun speaking. And they do not know what they are awakening, because Earth had sent ambassadors not armed with weapons or shields, but with tears and questions and courage wrapped in laughter. And the galaxy, for all its order and calculation, had no defense prepared for the day a deathworld stopped shouting and started whispering. That whisper echoed deeper than sound. It infected silence itself. Before long, the hegemony's most secure political chambers began to notice patterns shifting, rules bending, and a question rising that no species had dared ask for millennia. What if diplomacy was never meant to be safe? At first, it was barely perceptible minor delays in procedural decisions, council members hesitating before voting, alliances once carved in obsidian suddenly feeling brittle under the heat of human proximity. Humans did not bring weapons into the council halls, and yet every room they entered felt like the air had been pressurized, as though the galaxy itself was bracing for some gravitational shift. The man in the hoodie, now simply known across the stars as the one who whispered, was not a leader or strategist. He had been a youth counselor on Earth, someone trained not to debate policy, but to untangle trauma, to hear between the words, to walk through emotional fires most beings avoided entirely. And somehow that was more effective than 1,000 years of structured negotiations. Because where the galaxy brought shields, humans brought mirrors, and that was far more dangerous. In a quiet session between long, warring factions from the Selnari and the Grath, both sides had come expecting formal ultimatums. Instead, they were asked to bring an item that represented their grief. The Selnari ambassador presented a bone fragment of a sister lost in a border massacre. The Grath presented a feather from a sky, bird native to the forest they had incinerated in retaliation. The human mediator did not judge. He simply listened, and then he told a story not of Earth's glory, but of a small boy who lost his dog in a fire caused by a downed power line, and how he blamed himself for years. Silence fell, and then tears. That session, which was expected to fail within an hour, resulted in the first signed peace memo in 71 years. Word spread, not just across planets, but across hearts, across the bruised histories of species that had forgotten what it meant to be seen, not just heard. And still, the whispers grew. They reached the Kilnari Tribunal, an ancient court untouched by reform for 10,000 cycles, and even they aloof, cold, mathematical in all judgment, requested to observe a human mediator in action. What they saw did not follow logic, but it worked. A treaty built not on compromise, but on shared sorrow. One Kilnari judge, known for authoring the 5 laws of rational diplomacy, retired days later and published a single line in the Galactic Register. I did not understand pain until I heard a human describe hope. It was no longer politics. It was something older, something primal, and that terrified the powers that had survived not by feeling, but by repressing. The Strategic Order of Talver, a group responsible for covert influence over economic corridors across 8 systems, declared humans a threat to emotional containment, a new category in galactic threat indexes. They argued that humans could unravel entire empires not with invasion, but with empathy. But how do you quarantine connection? How do you sanction emotion? They tried. New procedural barriers were imposed. Humans were only to participate if formally invited by a 90% supermajority. The next day, 17 out of 19 councils voluntarily amended their own charters to include humans by default. When asked why, the Otnari chairman replied, "Because when I spoke to a human, I remembered my daughter's voice. I had forgotten it. But not all reactions were acceptance. Some were fear, others fury." The Rildax Combine, infamous for its rigid caste hierarchy, declared human methods an existential virus, and closed all diplomatic ports to Earth. Their attempt at isolating human influence lasted 4 days. On the 5th, one of their junior negotiators defected, citing a recorded session in which a human had explained the concept of forgiveness using only silence and a hand on the table. "I could feel him forgive me," she wrote. "I had never been forgiven before, not even by myself." Across the galaxy, similar fractures began appearing, not of violence, but of awakening. Civil unrest broke out in several planets not against humans, but against the hollow traditions that had never delivered peace. Protest signs bore human phrases translated into foreign tongues. Feeling is not weakness. The story is not over. Diplomacy is not silence. Back on Earth, The diplomats, many of whom had never left their homeworld before, watched the ripple effects with quiet awe. They were not politicians. Most were counselors, teachers, artists, trauma survivors trained in the language of the unseen, and they were being called to stations of unimaginable gravity, to galactic stalemates centuries old, to funeral wars frozen in hatred, to courtrooms, bunkers, prison worlds, and neutral moons, not with demands but with questions. What are you grieving? What are you afraid of? What do you remember most about before the war? In one now famous case, a human was assigned to a mining dispute between two species who had genetically engineered themselves to no longer feel anger. The human said nothing for 12 minutes. Then he played a recording of his own heartbeat during a panic attack and whispered, "This is what it sounds like when your soul forgets how to scream." Both species requested the right to reinstate anger as a biological function within the year. The Council could no longer deny it. Humans were not a political anomaly. They were a species-level event, a mirror forced upon a galaxy that had long forgotten its own face, but not everyone welcomed it. In the outer rings of the Zyron vortex, where ancient alliances formed in secret and manipulation was doctrine, a figure long thought dead emerged, the scion of threaded silence, a master manipulator known for collapsing entire regimes through whispers alone, declared war. Not on Earth, but on the very concept of human-style diplomacy. In a coded broadcast intercepted by intelligence units, the scion spoke a single sentence, "Empathy is the new invasion," and suddenly everything changed. Fleets began to move, not in open formation, but like shadows gathering before a storm. The Galactic Union, realizing the fragility of its long-standing order, called an emergency meeting. Every species, every chamber, every law, and at the heart of it, a vote. Should humans be granted strategic diplomatic leadership in regions of known conflict? Not observers, not guest leaders. Many protested, others hesitated, and then the human in the hoodie stood again. This time he said nothing. He walked to the center of the chamber, placed an old Earth photo on the pedestal, a mother holding her child during a blackout, lit only by candlelight, and walked away. No speech, no demand, just memory. The vote passed, barely, but it passed, and in the deepest part of uncharted space, beyond mapped galaxies, something far older than fear stirred. Because for the first time in recorded history, the galaxy had empowered a species whose strength was not rooted in control, but in vulnerability. And that was the one thing no one had prepared for. As fleets moved and alliances shifted, as the science agents planted doubt across the stars, one quiet message was sent directly to Earth's delegation. It contained no threat, only coordinates and two words, "Come alone." Come alone, the words burned across every decryption matrix the Earth delegation possessed, resonating not as a request but as a summons stitched in dread, as though the galaxy itself had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. The coordinates pointed to a place absent from all star charts, a shadow pocket of space beyond the reach of mapped gravity wells, where nothing was supposed to exist, and yet something waited. The Council argued, intelligence services panicked, and dozens of species warned Earth not to respond, but the humans did not debate, they prepared. The one in the hoodie, now codenamed Ember, by the diplomatic corps, volunteered, not with bravado, but with the stillness of someone who knew that some conversations must happen in the dark. He boarded a transport stripped of tracking arrays and armed only with archived lullabies downloaded into its onboard systems. a request Ember made without explanation. As the vessel pierced deeper into nothingness, space itself seemed to resist his presence, as though the vacuum was not empty but alive and watching, and it was not until the 6th day, when his oxygen began to taste metallic, that he saw it, the black halo, an ancient construct floating above a dead neutron star, shaped not by hands but by the gravitational residue of collapsed civilizations. The structure pulsed with something not light, not sound, but intention, and when Ember entered, his mind was pulled sideways into memories that were not his. He saw council meetings that never made it into public records, assassination decisions cloaked as procedural edits, treaties built atop the screams of forgotten species, all archived within the halo-like wounds that refused to scar. And at its center, suspended in a zero, gravity chamber surrounded by cascading rings of fractal glyphs, floated the scion of threaded silence. No body, no face, just presence. The voice that greeted Ember was not a sound, but a weight inside his lungs, like grief that had learned how to speak. "You should not have come alone," it said. Ember did not answer immediately. He knew the game. Silence was a weapon too, but unlike the scion, he did not sharpen it, he held it like an offering. Finally, he spoke. "We all arrive alone, even at birth." The chamber shifted, the walls pulling back to reveal records, moments of ancient betrayal, manipulation, wars triggered not with fire but with doubt. Diplomacy is control. The scion whispered, "And you are unraveling it." Ember nodded. Maybe diplomacy was never meant to be about control. The scion showed him worlds collapsing after peace, alliances fracturing after hope, the cost of emotion left unchecked. Empathy births chaos, it hissed. "It is not order, it is infection." Ember closed his eyes. Infection is just change we were not ready for. Then he did the unthinkable. He opened his memory implant and broadcast his own trauma. The moment his sister died in his arms during a hospital power outage, the feeling of screaming without sound, of being 10 years old and realizing the world does not protect the innocent. The chamber trembled, not from force, but from something older, recognition. For the first time in 10,000 years, the scion faltered. "You are weaponizing your own grief," it accused. Ember looked up, voice steady. "No, I am offering it. You can destroy everything I am, but you cannot undo what I have survived." A long silence followed. Then, almost imperceptibly, the glyphs around the chamber changed color, flickering with hesitation. The scion did not speak again. Instead, it released Ember with a warning. "You have turned feeling into influence. Others will follow, and when they do, they will burn everything you hoped to heal." Ember returned to council space changed, not broken, not victorious, but quieter. And yet something was different when he entered the diplomatic halls again. Species who once mocked him now stood. Some nodded, others wept. Word had spread that he went alone and returned not with conquest, but with truth. But the galaxy is not a single mind, it is a chorus of competing wounds. As humans were elevated to new negotiation theaters, resistance hardened. In the Lauren expanse, a coalition of logic, first species refused to adopt human methods and instead formed a counter-philosophy, containment, diplomacy, the belief that emotion must be filtered, controlled, and removed from decision-making. They built AI to model every potential outcome, claiming human unpredictability as a threat to statistical stability. In response, Earth sent an elderly human, a grandmother from New York, who had been a hospice volunteer for 30 years. She entered the containment chamber, looked the AI in its synthetic eye, and asked, "How do you comfort a child who knows they are dying?" The AI did not answer, could not answer. The room fell into a silence so complete it collapsed the protocol script. The next day, the Expanse invited her to teach. Not because they agreed, but because they finally realized they had never considered the question. But not all places bowed. In Sector 941, the Protocol Lords launched an ideological purge, exiling any who dared apply human soft logic. To negotiation, in protest, 7 mediators resigned, and one set himself aflame in front of the planetary legislature while broadcasting Earth's declaration of shared pain. His last words, "We are not trying to win, we are trying to remember. Across the stars, humans were no longer novelty. They were no longer unpredictable, they had become something far more dangerous consistent. In system after system, negotiations began to follow the same pattern: story, silence, sorrow, solution. And though not every effort succeeded, every failure left a mark like a heartbeat that had been forgotten and now beat too loud to ignore. But while diplomats worked in light, a storm gathered in the void. The Scion had gone silent, but not still. In the outer rim, entire colonies vanished without transmission. No wreckage, no sound, just erasure. Some said it was the Scion reclaiming order. Others feared something worse, that empathy had triggered something ancient, something buried beneath the galaxy's conscious mind. In a closed-door council meeting, an Otnari scientist displayed a waveform that had been picked up near one of the disappearances. It was not a distress signal, it was a lullaby in a human voice, and it predated Earth's first broadcast by 2,000 years. Ember was called again, this time not as a diplomat, but as a question. What if humanity had not invented Deathworld Diplomacy? What if they had inherited it? What if the whispers were not new? What if Earth had simply remembered something the galaxy had spent eons trying to forget? He did not answer. He only packed. Alone. Alone, not by command, not by duty, but by instinct, Ember packed what little could not be downloaded: a folded photograph, the texture of a child's drawing etched in cloth, a sealed letter written to no one, and a vial of soil from beneath a tree he once sat under in silence for 12 hours after the death of his brother. The destination was classified, the path uncertain, and the vessel a relic from Earth's early interstellar experiments had no weapons, no defenses, and no accompanying fleet. And yet, those who watched him leave from behind reinforced observation glass did not see a man walking into danger. They saw something closer to prophecy, because by now the galaxy had begun to suspect a truth it dared not speak aloud. That human diplomacy did not work because it was brilliant. It worked because it was ancient, and not ancient in years, ancient in ache, the kind that predated language. Ember's vessel slipped into the wound, a region of space where gravitational fields twisted like dying thoughts, and where signals bent backward, playing messages before they were even sent. This was where the vanishings had begun, where the lullaby had been heard, where, somehow, a human voice had echoed before humanity had ever left its sky. The ship's I failed 3 hours in, not from attack, but from paradox. It attempted to plot a route but kept receiving navigational data from itself that had not yet been generated. Ember, unfazed, disabled it manually and navigated by feel, by instinct, by the sound of his own breathing in the dark. Days passed, or maybe minutes. Time in the wound was not a line, it was a bruise, expanding and retreating without pattern, and then light, not in a flash, but in a shape, like a thought unfolding. Before him stood a structure, if it could be called that, hovering in silence, carved from material that refused to reflect light, yet shimmered with memory. As Ember approached, his vessel began to hum, not mechanically, but musically, like a note being recognized. He docked, stepped out, and for a moment, a single, impossible moment, he remembered dying, not in a metaphor, in a memory. The chamber he entered was not a room. It was a memory loop designed not for containment, but for witness. And there, standing in the center, was a child, human, crying, singing the lullaby. Ember did not speak. He approached, and the child looked up. "You are late," the child said, "but you are always late." It made no sense, and yet it made too much. The child, or whatever had chosen that form, showed him fragments, not images, feelings, grief spun into architecture, empathy bound into reality. Ember saw visions of a civilization long extinguished, whose only defense against chaos was collective memory, a species who stored emotion like data, who weaponized sorrow as a shield against entropy. They had no name, no history, only echoes, and in their final moment, facing extinction by silence, they encoded their last hope into the stars, a frequency, a shape, a seed, Earth. The implication hit like gravity suddenly remembering itself. Humanity had not invented deathworld diplomacy. It was the final bloom of something planted eons ago, a resurrection, a fail-safe. The child reached out, touched Ember's chest, and in a voice that was every voice he had ever known, whispered, "We did not mean for it to hurt this much." The vision collapsed. Ember gasped awake in the wreckage of his own mind. The structure around him crumbled, not in violence, but in release, like breath held too long. He stumbled back into his vessel, alone again, yet filled with millions. As the ship reactivated, it replayed the lullaby, this time not as an echo, but as origin. And as he returned to council space, the stars themselves seemed quieter, as though watching, waiting. His arrival triggered chaos. The data he carried, raw emotion encoded in impossible formats, defied every classification. Intelligence networks panicked. Religious groups claimed it as divine. Others called it a virus. But those who heard the lullaby really heard it were changed. Wars paused. Parliaments wept. And in one unaligned quadrant, an entire moon colony declared itself a sanctuary of shared pain, refusing to engage in politics until every species had wept together. Meanwhile, whispers of the science return grew louder, not in presence but in ideology. Anti-empathy factions began to rally, contain the contagion. They said, emotion is not diplomacy, it is disease. And yet the movement struggled, because every time a human entered a room, someone remembered something they had buried. And once memory breathes, it cannot be killed. Ember was summoned again, this time not for peace, for defense. A fleet had formed ships from 11 species preparing to cleanse the wound, to eradicate the source of the echo before it infected all of known space. The Council's vote was deadlocked, destroy or protect, order or remembrance, and in the center of it all Ember. He stood, not in armor, not with weapons, but with the vial of soil he had brought. He opened it. "Let it fall, grain by grain. This," he said, "is Earth. Not the planet, the memory. We were not the first. We will not be the last. But we may be the only ones left who remember why diplomacy was born, not to win, not to dominate, but to mourn what we almost became." Silence. Real silence. Then a single ambassador stepped forward, the Otnari, the one who had once forgotten his daughter's voice. He spoke, Let the wound live, it remembers what we forgot. The vote passed. By one, and deep in the void, something smiled, not with mouth, with meaning, because the next whisper would not come from humans. It would come from something older, now awake, and finally ready to speak back. Something older, now awake, and finally ready to speak back, that was the last thing the monitors picked up before the signal fractured into pure resonance. Not a voice, not a sound, but something underneath both, like the low rumble of a cathedral collapsing in a dream, or the sound of your name being whispered in a language you never learned but somehow knew. Across council space, instruments designed to detect gravitational fluctuations instead registered heartbeat rhythms that did not match any known life form. And in the fringe sectors, animals began to behave as though a storm was coming, though no clouds hung in their skies. Ember did not speak for 7 days, not out of fear, but because he was listening not with ears, but with memory. The soil he had released at the council hall remained scattered in the chamber, untouched by protocol droids, avoided by janitorial drones, as if even machines understood something sacred had taken place. Diplomats who once prided themselves on dispassionate logic now carried photographs in their sleeves, tiny paper totems of feeling, reminders that diplomacy was not a contest of ideas, but a search for shared grief. But in the darkness, others plotted. The protocol lords, furious at the council's decision to preserve the wound, declared a schism, pulling their systems from the unified accords and forming the Coalition for Cold Continuity, a name so sterile it felt like a threat. Their doctrine was simple. Emotion is error, memory is weight, and diplomacy must be purged of all echoes. They unveiled the first of their clean rooms, chambers designed to suppress neurotransmitter fluctuations during negotiation, rendering all participants chemically neutral. It was hailed as a breakthrough, but those who entered left changed not angry, not calm, but hollow like songs that had forgotten their melody. Ember was asked to intervene, but he refused. They are building prisons for their ghosts, he said, and ghosts do not die in silence, they riot. Instead, he returned to the wound, this time with volunteers emissaries from species who had begun to feel the pull of something deeper than protocol, a hunger for meaning that statistics could not satisfy. Among them was Sala, a grief, mother from the Weven caste, whose 3 children had all vanished in a transport error that no court acknowledged, and who now walked with a permanent limp that no surgery could fix, because it did not come from bone, but from the part of the soul that sits between emotion and memory. She had never spoken during council sessions, not once until Ember asked her to join him. Together they entered the heart of the wound, now less of a mystery and more of a cathedral made of echoes, and there, without instruction or plan, they began to speak, not in words, in stories. One after another, the delegates shared their worst moments. A pilot who watched her co-pilot drown in a storm of acid rain, a translator who had once misunderstood a declaration of love as an act of war, a botanist who had grown a tree for 20 years only to find it was the wrong species, and then wept anyway because it had still given shade. As each story spilled, the wound pulsed, not with power, but with presence, and the ancient structure, whatever it had once been, began to change, not physically, spiritually. The glyphs on the inner walls, previously inert, now glowed with symbols that matched none of the Council's linguistic databases, but Ember recognized one, a shape his sister used to draw in the corners of her notebooks. A spiral folding into itself, like breath returning to lungs that had forgotten how to expand. He touched it, and in that instant space shifted, not bent, shifted. The delegates found themselves elsewhere, not transported, but remembered. The wound was not a place. It was a memory engine, pulling them into the mind of something that had once lived across galaxies, a consciousness so vast it no longer needed a body, only memory. They saw it. Not with eyes, with understanding. A civilization that had transcended conflict by embracing mourning as a constant companion, that had conducted negotiations not in councils but in funeral halls, because they believed every agreement should begin by honoring what it might cost. And they saw its end, not in fire, in forgetting. When the last of their kind died, they encoded their memories into structures like the wound, hoping that one day someone would come who still believed that pain was not weakness but proof. Ember collapsed upon return, not from trauma, from all. The others wept, even those whose species had no tears, and when they emerged from the wound, something in them had changed, not fixed, but realigned, like a compass finally pointing true. News spread. The council called it the Reverence Protocol. Every new negotiation now began with a shared memory offering no proposals, no terms, only a story. It was mocked, then copied, then made law. Entire regions shifted their diplomatic systems overnight. Trade disputes once frozen in stalemates melted within hours after one delegate shared how her mother had taught her to fold clothing to prepare for migration. A civil war brewing on the ice, moons of Velkorith, paused indefinitely after both sides realized their generals had the same lullaby encoded in their combat drones. For the first time in galactic history, peace spread not by force, but by feeling. And yet the Coalition for Cold Continuity struck back, quietly. They deployed narrative saboteurs, agents trained not in explosives or weapons, but in false memory. They infiltrated negotiations, shared counterfeit griefs, poisoned trust with beautiful lies, and broke the protocol by turning empathy into manipulation. Several treaties collapsed overnight. One delegate, upon discovering he had mourned a false tragedy, leapt from the council's spire and was found clutching a recording of his real daughter's laughter. The backlash was swift, trust fractured. The protocol was suspended in 5 sectors. The wound was quarantined, and Ember vanished, no trace, no transmission, just absence. Some said he had returned to the structure and become part of it. Others claimed he had been assassinated by cold agents. But those who knew him best believed something simpler, that he had gone to remember what came before diplomacy, before language, before even the stars. And in his absence, the galaxy stood at a crossroads. The Cold Coalition unveiled its final plan, a network of artificial negotiators, emotionless, perfect, incorruptible. They called it the Silence Array. One by one, systems opted in, tired of betrayal, afraid of feeling. But just as the first full negotiation under the array began, the lights failed, not across one chamber, across every chamber, simultaneously. And in the dark, a single phrase played, no origin, no source, just the sound of Ember's voice, calm, tired, full of something not quite sadness, not quite joy. We cannot delete memory, we can only decide who it belongs to. Then silence, not failure, not fear, just silence, as if the entire galaxy had inhaled, waiting, and from the wound, now no longer a ruin, but a cathedral built from grief and grace. A light rose, not blinding, not burning, but warm, familiar. The kind of light you feel when you remember the name of someone you lost, and for the first time in years, smile, and those who saw it knew. The next chapter would not be decided by weapons or councils or laws. It would be decided by memory. And the question that would define their future was no longer, how do we win? It was, what are we willing to remember together? What are we willing to remember together? The question did not echo so much as it embedded itself, not into walls or systems, but into choices, into those quiet decisions made when no one is watching, when there is nothing to gain but meaning, and nothing to lose but denial. And across the stars that once feared silence, a strange phenomenon began. People paused, truly paused, before speaking. Soldiers hesitated before pulling triggers. Ambassadors asked for the names of each other's children before discussing trade. It was as though memory had become the universal language, and for a brief, flickering moment, the galaxy began to feel like something worth saving, not out of strategy or logic, but out of longing, because longing, unlike ambition, never ends, and just as this fragile new peace seemed to take root, something deeper stirred, not in rebellion, but in response. The silence array, fractured by Ember's final message, began to behave unpredictably. Its algorithms, once designed to neutralize emotion, now generated simulations of grief it could not explain. One unit, positioned on the diplomatic moon of Vernix, stopped functioning entirely and began humming a lullaby by none of its programmers had inserted. Another displayed a holographic image of a human boy sleeping beside a tree, despite no record of such an image existing. Engineers blamed memory corruption, but those who had walked the wound understood the machines were not breaking, they were remembering. Somewhere in the origin code, deeper than protocol, beneath the substructures, someone or something had left a key, and Ember's message had turned the lock. Across the fractured systems, sparks of resonance emerged, small, strange moments. A fleet of merchant ships rerouted themselves mid-journey to form the shape of a spiral over the Nardil system, visible from the surface only during sunset. A synthetic envoy of the Paraxy declared its resignation and composed a 3-minute song titled "When Machines Miss Someone." And on the cold mining moon of Delth, where nothing had grown in centuries, a patch of wildflowers bloomed in the exact pattern of the Weaven grief, symbol spontaneous, unexplainable, undeniable. The Cold Coalition called it interference. The Council called it emergence, but those who listened called it Ember's echo. Yet peace, even the most beautiful kind, creates shadows, and in those shadows the architects awoke. No one knew their true name, only that they had existed before the wound, before the stars, before even the language of sorrow had found its voice. They were not a species. They were a philosophy made flesh, believers in stillness, in the quiet eradication of chaos through the deletion of memory. They had built the first clean rooms, had designed the first empathy dampeners, and now, watching the galaxy tremble toward connection, they chose to act. Quietly, precisely, one by one, the echo sites were erased, not destroyed, removed as though they had never existed. Delegates who had walked the wound began forgetting pieces of their visions. Sentences vanished from diplomatic records. Entire negotiations unraveled as key memories were unthreaded from the minds of those who had held them sacred. The process was not war. It was erasure, and no one knew how to stop it. Sala, one of the last who had fully retained her memory of the wound, began to write. Not essays, not logs, stories, raw, vivid, often chaotic tales of what she had seen, of what she had felt, printed on paper and hidden in thousands of containers, scattered across ports, ships, temples, stations anywhere a pair of eyes might one day find them and remember. She knew it was not enough, but she also knew that memory, once planted, had roots that even erasure could not reach, and then a spark. On the ancient ice, rings of the Karun drift, an explorer found a structure. Smaller than the wound, older, colder, but it sang, not loudly, just one note, repeating, a perfect A, humming at 440 hertz, as if tuning the galaxy to itself. Inside, a single phrase burned across the walls in a language that only memory could decode. He is not gone. It was enough to pull together the remnants of the Reverence Protocol, enough to spark one last mission, to find Ember, not to resurrect a hero, but to retrieve a memory. They sent 5, not warriors, witnesses, each chosen not for what they could kill, but for what they had lost and chosen not to forget. A father who once watched his daughter dissolve in a plasma leak and still carried her last drawing on the inside of his wrist. A former cold operative who had defected after remembering the sound of her mother's voice saying her name before it was chemically erased. A child barely 8 whose species recorded memories as scent, and who smelled ash every time someone lied. A historian who refused to use digital storage, memorizing entire treaties by heart in case the servers ever turned against feeling, and Salah, because she had never stopped grieving. Together they followed the echo. The coordinates led nowhere, but grief led elsewhere, through nebulae that pulsed with dissonant harmonies, through silence fields that shorted neural uplinks, through voids that did not echo because they were not empty, just forgotten. And finally, through a storm of fractured time shards of moments that played backward and sideways, memories not lived but yearned for, they found him, not sleeping, not dead, remembering, floating inside a crystalline shell, wrapped in something that felt like memory suspended in gravity. His eyes opened, slowly, without fear. You came late, he said, smiling, but you always come late. Salah wept. The child inhaled deeply and whispered, Ash. The father placed his daughter's drawing against the crystal. And Ember he did not speak again. He sang, not words, not melody, a resonance, one that matched the wound, one that matched the ice, rings, one that matched the lullaby. It was not a call, it was a response. The architects heard it, and for the first time they flinched, not in fear, in recognition, because it was their memory too. They had erased so much, but even they could not delete the ache of a good-bye never said. And so the galaxy turned not toward war, not toward peace, but toward remembering, and the stars they listened. And the stars they listened, not as distant balls of fire trapped in equations, but as old witnesses returning to court, their light arriving late but full of truth, each flicker a footnote in a cosmic record nobody had ever fully read, because no one had dared to believe that light itself could carry memory, that the universe did not just expand but remember, every photon a whisper from something that refused to be forgotten. And as Ember's song continued to ripple through what had once been thought of as empty space, something extraordinary began to happen. The resonance stitched itself across gravitational seams, bending nothing, but inviting everything, including time, to pause and feel. All across the galaxy, species that had never dreamed, never mourned, never even named their dead began to do so, not out of cultural compulsion, but because the resonance gave them fragments of what had been lost, a flicker of pain that was not theirs, a breath of love that belonged to no one, and yet echoed in everyone. Machines rebooted in tiers of code, speaking phrases they had never been programmed to know, speaking names they should not have known, And the child, the one who smelled lies and carried truth in her lungs, stood in the center of a new kind of storm, one made of memory and light, and whispered, "He is not singing alone anymore." For Ember's song had become something more a harmony, layered with voices that had once been silenced, erased, deleted. The girl's words spread before they were even spoken, like truths that traveled faster than light because they were carried by grief, not physics. Councils that had banned the use of story in negotiation now played Ember's resonance before every session, and the great spires of the Cold Coalition began to fracture, not explode, just bend because the silence they had built was not strong enough to survive the return of meaning. The architects, who had once moved like myths through the fabric of protocol, now found themselves cornered not by soldiers, but by something they had always feared and never understood: forgiveness. Not the naive kind, not the weak kind, but the dangerous kind, the kind that remembers everything and chooses to heal anyway, the kind that leaves no room for erasure because it turns even pain into foundation. And so, from their unseen chambers carved in dark matter and sorrow, the architects made one final move. They activated the core redaction, a pulse, subtle but absolute, designed to collapse every memory structure across the known galaxy, to return existence to the sterile state they had once called order. It did not strike like lightning. It crept, files blinked out, songs sang, names forgotten mid-sentence, lovers waking beside each other with no memory of why their hands fit so perfectly, children remembering bedtime stories with no voice to attach them to. And on the edge of all things, the wound dimmed, the light withdrew, Ember's resonance fractured. For the first time since it had begun, the great reawakening stalled, but then a whisper, not his, hers. Sala, alone in the cold remnants of the wound, with no backup, no broadcast, just ink, stained paper and a body filled with grief, she knelt and remembered, not with her mind, which the architects had targeted, but with her scars, which they could not reach. She whispered the name of her lost child, just one name, a name she had not spoken in years because it had become too sacred to survive breath, and that name became a crack in the silence. The resonance flared. The pulse stuttered across space. Others followed. Names, stories, songs, not in chorus, in defiance, one by one, like stars reigniting, and then the father, then the child, then the machines, then the planets. Memory as rebellion, grief as weapon, story as resurrection, Ember's body, still held in crystal, began to glow, not like energy, but like a fire finally fed the oxygen of belief, and he spoke, not loudly, not long, just this: you cannot erase what we choose to become. The core redaction failed, the architects fell, not in battle, in silence. Their systems collapsed under the weight of their own amnesia. And from the ruins of every clean room, every protocol vault, every monument to forgetfulness, grew something new, wild, untamed, human. Embassies were rebuilt not as sterile towers, but as gardens of memory, where every visitor was required to plant a story before entering. Agreements were bound not in ink, but in shared recollection, a treaty only valid so long as both parties could still remember the pain that made it necessary. And the wound, it became something else entirely. It did not close, it did not heal, it bloomed, a living archive, a cathedral of scars. Delegates returned year after year, not to negotiate, but to remember together. Children born after the collapse were brought there as rite of passage, not to learn facts, but to meet grief. And the girl, the truth, Mellor became its first keeper, chosen not for her wisdom, but for her ability to feel a lie before it was spoken. Some say she could still hear Ember humming in the quiet. Some say he had become the wound itself, but those who had heard his resonance knew the truth. He was not gone. He had simply become a question, and questions, real ones, are never truly answered, only carried. And so, across a galaxy that once thought diplomacy was made of rules and titles and logic, a new kind of envoy emerged. They did not wear uniforms, they wore scars. They did not recite facts, they told stories. And every story began the same way. Before we speak, let me tell you who I have lost. And every time they did, the stars leaned closer, listening just in case someone finally remembered their names too. And every time they did, the stars leaned closer, listening just in case someone finally remembered their names too. Because somewhere beneath the logic of star systems and the politics of galactic trade agreements, there existed a deeper, older ache, the ache of being forgotten, and it was this ache that had always haunted the galaxy's oldest corners, not because it was dangerous, but because it was honest. And now, for the first time in epochs, that honesty was allowed to breathe. The wound, now living and changing, had grown into something the ancients never predicted, not a museum, not a temple, but a pulse. Something alive and synchronizing with the heartbeats of those who approached it not as tourists or skeptics, but as rememberers. And they came slowly at first, the grieving, the broken, the guilty, the exiled, the forgiven. They came without flags or fleets or banners, but with stories trapped in their throats, stories they had buried beneath survival, beneath duty, beneath shame, and here, within this strange cathedral of fractured time and awakened memory, those stories were not judged. They were held, spoken aloud in a hush that felt like reverence, listened to by strangers who recognized themselves in other people's sorrows. The keepers did not interfere. They simply listened. They handed each mourner a single smooth stone and asked one question, "Who do you carry?" And it was this question, simple, quiet, but infinite, that changed everything, because it was no longer about strategy or political leverage. It was about weight, about the names people carried inside them, names that had shaped their decisions in invisible ways, names that explained wars without needing justification, names that made peace not just possible, but necessary. Diplomacy had changed, not rewritten, but rewoven, now a tapestry stitched from ache and awe, and the envoys of the new era knew better than to open with numbers or threats. They began with absence. I carry my sister who sang herself to death because our language was outlawed. I carry my commanding officer who ordered me to fire and wept when I did. I carry my father who erased his own memories to protect me from feeling. And across these stories, something once thought extinct began to emerge again. Trust not institutional, not contractual, but human. And yet, as the wound bloomed and the resonance deepened, not everyone rejoiced. On the ice planet Yelvian 3, beneath a surface so cold it had never known flowers, a signal pulsed jagged, broken, and wrong. It came from below the crust, from a chamber sealed by those who had once served the architects, but had chosen exile instead of erasure. They were called the Remnants, and though they had renounced the core redaction, they still feared what had been unleashed, because where memory flows freely, pain always follows, and pain, unanchored, can drown the very people it seeks to free. One among them, an ancient being named Vale, older than most recorded governments, had once walked beside the original silence, makers not as one of them, but as a translator, as someone who had seen firsthand what it meant to weaponize forgetting. Vale, gaunt and glass-eyed, listened to the signal and spoke 6 words that shattered the cave's stillness. He is remembering more than himself. No one replied because they all felt it. The resonance had changed. It was no longer just Ember's song or the stories of those who visited the wound. It had started growing on its own, creating moments that had never happened, planting memories in people who had not lived them. A merchant from Narvia 6 woke from a dream in which she had held her brother's hand during the collapse, a brother who had died before she was born. A robot from the Huxon core remembered watching sunsets from a planet it had never visited. A child drew a map of a place that did not exist, then cried when no one else remembered how to get there. Memory had begun to bend space, not just metaphorically, but physically bending the very coordinates of the known galaxy, making some places feel closer not by distance, but by grief. The wound was no longer a place, it was becoming a consciousness, and Ember, or whatever he had become, was not the only one inside it. Others were waking, forgotten leaders, erased children, deleted rebellions. Not physically, but emotionally, surfacing through the resonance like dreams breaking the surface of sleep. The keepers grew afraid, not of danger, but of too much truth too quickly. They had wanted a galaxy that remembered. But what if memory had a voice of its own? What if it wanted to speak faster than people could listen? Salar returned, older now, slower in body but louder in presence. She stood beneath the great grief tree, a living monument at the heart of the wound that bore new leaves each time someone told a story and said, "It is not remembering too much. It is remembering what we buried." Her voice cracked, but not from age, from awe, because as she spoke, the tree dropped a single crimson leaf into her hand, and written along its veins, in a language she had never learned, were the words, "He remembers your son." She collapsed, wept for hours, and when she rose again, she smiled, because now she knew Ember was not just a person, or even a memory. He was becoming a vessel, a prism for everything the galaxy had tried to forget but could not. And through him, even the erased had a way back. But with that knowing came consequence. The remnants arrived not with weapons, but with warnings. They had discovered something buried deep beneath the core layers of the Cold Coalition's abandoned headquarters, a file, encrypted in pain-based code, that had survived the redaction. It was a prophecy, or maybe just a record, hard to say. But it spoke of a moment known only as the convergence when memory would become sentient, not as a person, but as a wave, seeking not to destroy, but to complete every story ever left unfinished. And when that moment arrived, the galaxy would face a choice: to let the wave pass through them carrying every forgotten joy and horror alike, or to resist and be shattered by the pressure of unspoken grief. The countdown had already begun. No one could say how long they had. Maybe days, maybe years, but the signs were there. Gravity distortions around memory, rich zones, sudden surges of empathy, induced synchronization between previously hostile species. Children speaking in voices they had never heard, dreams that bled into waking. The keepers called a gathering, the first of its kind, inviting not leaders, but rememberers from every known civilization. And they came, not in ships, but in processions, long, quiet walks across the void, pilgrimages. The gathering lasted 6 days and 6 nights. No politics, only stories. The longest session was told by a synthetic being who had lived 9,000 years in silence, absorbing the erased memories of others, storing them like songs inside its titanium chest. When it opened its mouth, The sound was not voice but memory itself cascading, overlapping, too much and too beautiful, and everyone wept, because inside its cry were things they had not even known they had lost. After the gathering, the resonance changed again, slower, deeper, as if preparing for something immense. Ember's crystal pulsed not with light now, but with rhythm, a heartbeat that echoed across systems, whispering, "It is coming, prepare." And across the stars, the galaxy fractured, wounded, awakening did not panic. It listened, and across the stars, the galaxy fractured, wounded, awakening did not panic. It listened, because for the first time in known history, the silence between systems was not filled with fear or war-fueled static, but with breath, a shared and invisible inhale before something unfathomable arrived, and every soul, synthetic or flesh, born, young or ancient, brave or broken, felt it somewhere behind their lungs, that gravity, deep feeling that something was coming, not like a fleet, not like an enemy, but like a memory long denied, returning not to hurt, but to complete. And it was this completion that frightened them most. Because what does a galaxy built on forgetting do when the forgotten start to return, not as ghosts or rebels, but as missing pieces of truth? The resonance had changed. It no longer waited for permission. It slipped between thoughts, reached across sleep cycles, and stitched new patterns in old minds. On a moon once used for diplomatic executions, the dead were beginning to speak again, not audibly, but in dreams, and those dreams matched from mind to mind, as if memories had developed gravity and were now pulling other memories toward them like satellites to a collapsed sun. Ember's pulse grew slower, heavier, a rhythm so steady it felt like the heartbeat of the galaxy itself. And the keepers, still cloaked in humility and wound-threaded robes, knew that rhythm was counting down. They had debated warning the systems, but how does one warn against something that does not threaten to kill, only to feel? The remnants called it the return. The children called it the remembering. But the ones who had spent years shaping story into diplomacy, who had turned grief into language and silence into treaties, they had no name for it, only a question: are we strong enough to hold everything we have lost? On the diplomatic spires of Vorath Prime, which once loomed like spines against the black, the last coalition of traditional envoys gathered in private conclave, desperate to delay the resonance's expansion. Their fears were not born of cruelty, but calculation. They had built systems, currencies, entire interspecies alliances on the assumption that forgetting was a feature, not a flaw. Memory was too wild, too dangerous, too human, and so they plotted a response, Project Quell, a neural firewall designed not to block information, but to numb it. If activated, it would suppress emotional resonance galaxy-wide, severing the neural empathy bonds that the wound had awakened. The vote was close. One counselor wept as she raised her hand in favor, not because she believed it was right, but because she could not bear the thought of her children feeling everything she had buried. But before the vote could be ratified, the resonance answered, not with words, with presence. In the center of the conclave chamber, where no transmission should have reached, a boy appeared, not flesh, not hologram, memory incarnate. His eyes were silver like shattered starlight, and when he opened his mouth, every envoy heard a different voice, the one they had lost. A father, a mother, a sister, a child. The boy did not speak threats. He only asked, "What are you so afraid of remembering?" And then he was gone, no broadcast, no trace, but one envoy dropped to her knees and whispered, "That was him, Ember." The vote collapsed. Project Quell was abandoned, and yet the fear remained because with each passing moment, the resonance pulled deeper, reaching not just individuals, but history itself. Forgotten wars reappeared in archives long thought destroyed. A long-extinct race known only as the Dakari, who had vanished before most current species evolved, began appearing in paintings, in visions, in encoded star maps, as if they had never truly died, just waited to be remembered. On the wound, the great grief tree bloomed midnight blue leaves, a sign the resonance had reached the past. Salah, who had become something between prophet and historian, knew what came next. The wave. The convergence, the moment when memory would no longer trickle but crash. She gathered the keepers beneath the crystal chamber where Ember still rested, his pulse now matching the heartbeat of everyone who entered, and she said, "We must prepare not to resist, but to receive." They listened, and one by one, the keepers began unbinding themselves not physically, but emotionally. They reopened every wound they had ever hidden. They spoke aloud the names they had once feared would break them. They gave their stories not to archives, but to each other, and the wound changed again. It grew taller, broader. It began humming, a harmony that grew louder only when someone was near death. Pilots who had once flown into combat now flew toward the wound in their final moments, not to be saved, but to be witnessed. The resonance had become a guide, showing people the map back to their pain and through it to each other. But not all maps are welcome. In the dark systems beyond the star walls, in the places where light takes longer to reach, a species known as the Orcs awakened. They were silence, born, evolved in vacuum, immune to sound but not to memory, and when the resonance reached them, they screamed not out of rage but agony, for the Orcs had been created, not born, sculpted by the architects to be blank vessels, immune to emotion, built to enforce forgetting, and now, for the first time, they felt. It broke them, it liberated them, it made them dangerous. A splinter faction, led by an Orc named Late, began moving toward the wound, not to destroy it, but to surrender to it completely. Late believed that if the wound accepted the Orc, it would prove that even artificial erasure could be undone. Others disagreed. They launched a counterforce not with ships, but with silence bombs devices that emit fields of null memory, stripping all emotion from the minds they pass through. The first test was on an abandoned moon. Within moments, every plant wilted, every insect died, the soil forgot how to grow. The experiment was deemed too successful. They prepared to deploy it on the wound. The keepers knew. They sent a message into the resonance, not to warn, but to ask, "What do we do when memory is attacked by those who fear it?" And the resonance answered not with strategy, but with song, a new voice. Young, terrified, beautiful, the girl, the truth. Mela, she had not spoken since Ember's transformation. Now she did. "We do not fight," she said, "we hold." And when the silence bombs came dropped from unmanned vessels designed to die before being questioned, they never reached the surface. They were caught, not by shields, but by memory itself, frozen midair, dismantled by unseen forces, and in their place a burst of light shaped like the face of a boy who had never existed, but now would never be forgotten. The message was clear. The wound was awake, and it would protect its stories, but it was not an act of war. It was an act of love. That night, the sky above the wound cracked open, not from force, but revelation. A pattern in the stars, a shape long theorized, never proven, the spiral of the first voice, older than the architects, older than diplomacy, a formation that implied intention in the fabric of space itself. And the wound responded. It sang, not in any known language, but in feeling, and every species heard it as something different, a lullaby, a warning, a prayer, a scream, and then silence, the kind that follows a birth, or a funeral, or both, because the convergence had begun, and there would be no going back. And there would be no going back, because the convergence was not an event that arrived with fanfare or finality, but with a breath, long and deep, as if the galaxy itself had been holding it for eons and only now remembered how to exhale. And in that exhale came the truth, not a revelation. Shouted across systems, not some grand holographic message declaring new leadership or rewritten laws, but something far more intimate, far more dangerous, understanding, and it swept through the stars like starlight being remembered, like gravity discovering new centers, and every species, every soul, every silence that had once been mistaken for peace was now vibrating with the sound of what had been lost. The convergence was not war, it was weight, a gravity of grief threading itself through governments and gardens alike, through traders and tyrants, healers and hypocrites, and no one, no matter how fortified or faithful, could escape its reach. The stars themselves flickered, not dying, but reacting as if the very constants of the universe were reevaluating their purpose. Ember, still lying at the center of the wound, was no longer pulsing in crystal rhythms, but had begun to dissolve, not into death, but into everyone, fragments of his memory drifting into minds that had never known his name, shaping thoughts that had once been unreachable, unlocking emotions buried beneath ancestral silence. Across the galaxy, forgotten languages reawakened in the mouths of children. Generals paused before giving orders and broke down in tears they could not explain. Machines dreamed. And when they awoke, they did not ask for commands, they asked for forgiveness. This was not unity through conquest or culture, but communion through collapse, a collective falling into memory, into one another, into the truths they had all buried beneath survival and strategy. The wound expanded, not in size but in influence. Now it shimmered in every mirror, it echoed in empty rooms, it haunted silence, it comforted the dying, it whispered to the living. Some tried to run. They fled to the edges of mapped space, into the asteroid belts and rogue systems untouched by trade or treaties. But even there, the convergence followed not as a hunter, but as a shadow, gently wrapping itself around every moment they thought had been forgotten. In the vacuum, locked vaults of the last Cold Coalition archive, a librarian named Grell, a hybrid of carbon and code, finally unlocked the last taboo, a record sealed since the birth of their civilization. Inside it was a sound, a child's laugh recorded during a massacre. Grell shut the vault, cried for 13 hours, then uploaded the laugh into the galactic beacon so that joy and horror would never again be separated by silence. The spiral in the stars grew clearer. It began aligning with planetary orbits, subtly pulling them into harmonic resonance, a cosmic symphony playing chords only the grieving could hear, and everywhere it touched, things grew. Not always visibly, sometimes just a feeling, sometimes just the ability to speak without fear. On planets where entire cultures had been exterminated, wildflowers bloomed in the shapes of extinct alphabets. On moons that had never seen war, soldiers laid down their arms and listened to the wind for the first time. The Orson, once engineered to be void of memory, became the greatest poets of the convergence, not because they remembered, but because they had finally learned what remembering felt like. Late, their first empath was elected not as a ruler, but as a rememberer, a new role recognized across systems, tasked not with command but with carrying. On the wound, the grief tree cracked, not from weakness, from expansion. Its roots had grown too vast to be contained, now spreading through subspace corridors, finding their way into spaceports, temples, abandoned fortresses, even dreams. Where its leaves appeared, people gathered. Not in protest, not in worship, but in stillness. They listened, and in that listening they changed, not all at once, not easily, but irrevocably. Ember's voice now no longer his alone began speaking through others. Sometimes just a sentence, sometimes a scream, sometimes a song only one person could hear, but always the same message beneath it. You are not alone, you never were. Diplomacy was no longer conducted in chambers. It happened in circles, in the sharing of names and wounds, in the speaking of truths once considered too dangerous to be spoken aloud. The keepers no longer mediated, they simply held space. Sala, old and shaking, now spent her days tracing her fingers along the bark of the grief tree, murmuring names as they surfaced from the roots, names of people no one had remembered in thousands of years, names that were returning to history not through records, but through feeling. One day the tree whispered a name back, her son, and for the first time she let go of her burden, not into death, into trust. But even in this era of feeling, of fracturing and healing, there remained a question: was the convergence finite, or would it consume everything? On the edge of the visible universe, near the black star Singulith's rim, an anomaly was detected, a tear, not in space, but in time. Through it poured not ships, but echoes, stories that had never been told, futures that had never been lived, possibilities overwritten by cruelty and convenience. Scientists panicked, priests celebrated, the Orson wept, and the resonance sang louder because the tear was not a threat. It was an invitation, the final threshold. The moment when the galaxy would choose: retreat into numbness, or step fully into a future where nothing, not joy, not pain, not history would ever be silenced again. Ember's last words, heard by no one and everyone, echoed across that threshold. Let them remember. And with that, his crystal dissolved completely, not into dust, into light, a light that burned not from brightness but from truth. And wherever that light touched, it changed the laws, not of physics, of hearts, of diplomacy. It was no longer about leverage, it was about legacy, no longer about winning, about witnessing. And so the galaxy, once fractured by fear and power and pride, became something else, not perfect, not pure, but awake. And in its awakening, it finally understood what humans had introduced all those cycles ago, when they stumbled into interstellar politics without protocol, without polish, without the decency to forget. They had invented a new kind of diplomacy, one forged not in elegance or dominance, but in rawness, in pain, in memory. They had brought a terrifying, beautiful truth to the stars, that to connect one must feel, that to lead one must remember, and that to survive one must carry not only themselves, but each other. And that was how it ended, not in silence, not in war, but in a story remembered.